Hello, folks, and welcome to the Unconventional Path, entrepreneurship and innovation stories and ideas. Hello, I'm Bela.and.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Mike, today's guest on the podcast is Brant Cooper. He is a New York Times best-selling author of The Lean Entrepreneur and the CEO and founder of Moves the Needle. Brant works as a trusted advisor to startups and large enterprises around the world. With more than 25 years of expertise in changing industrial age mindset into the digital age opportunities. Learn more about him at brantcooper.com.
Bela, I'm really excited to hear what Brant has to say. You know, when I first got I was working on my PhD in the 1990s, early 1990s. Lean manufacturing was a big thing, right? And how do we get our factories to be less wasteful? And that always to me was something that was really interesting. And then 10 or 15 years later, when I was teaching entrepreneurship, and that kind of moved into my area of interest. Then this idea of the lean startup, right? Using some of the principles from lean manufacturing, right, came into play, and that really took over a lot of how we teach entrepreneurship. And now here's the lean entrepreneur, and I'm really interested to hear how this concept of lean is evolving, and it's again kind of making it more relevant for people who are starting and running their own businesses. So I'm really interested. Let's what do you think? Let's let it roll.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's dive into this one. Hello, listeners. Welcome to the podcast today. Today I have a great guest, Brant Cooper. Welcome to the podcast, Brant.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, sure. So let me ask you a question. If you're at a social event, a non-work related social event, and you get introduced to somebody, and after the introductions, they ask you, hey, Brant, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
I typically answer it with, I try to teach large organizations how to be more entrepreneurial.
Ah, great answer. Great answer. And then if they say, well, what does that mean? What's the next paragraph?
So the next paragraph basically goes that, the world has changed, yet we manage all of our institutions as if we're still in the middle of the industrial age. And we're in the digital age now, and so we really need to learn how to manage and structure work differently for the digital age.
Yeah. So I was reading over your bio and stuff, and that looks like a topic you've been focused on for a little while here.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about, how things in the industrial age, sort of traditionally, they work.
Well, I like to have people imagine Henry Ford's assembly line, right? So it's he famously said you could have a Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black, and his contribution wasn't the automobile. Automobiles existed before. Right. It was his ability to manufacture an automobile to at such a cost that the middle class could afford it, and that copied a million times, really led to the boom in the industrial age. And so if you imagine, if you're producing one vehicle in only one color, the most efficient way of doing that is having this very fixed assembly line where everybody is doing the same thing over and over again. Yes. And if you look at Taylor's Science of Management, that's true in the white collar side of the business as well. So the white collar side of the business is merely an extension of the assembly line where everyone is supposed to be doing the same thing they did yesterday, and you hire layers of hierarchy in order to manage people doing the same thing that we've already figured out. We already figured out how to build, improve, manufacture, distribute, market, sell automobiles. So this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
But if you look at today is completely upside down. It's completely opposite of that. There's, literally hundreds, if not thousands of options, colors, models that you can buy, whether it's a gasoline powered or diesel or now electric. There's a lot of power that's in the hands of the consumer. They get to choose one or the other. They get to change their mind. They get to go to a different vendor, a different brand. And so instead of everything being known in the center of a company, like in Ford's age, now there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity, even in trying to sell an automobile. And so the information really resides on the edge of the company instead of the center of the company. Well, so if you're managing your company in the same old way, top down, hierarchical, command and control from the top to the bottom, and yet all of the information resides on the edge of the company, you're in trouble. You're slow, you're not customer focused, you're not able to change based upon current conditions that change. And so really we this is an age of agile. We have to decentralize decision making. We have to introduce new communications flows so that that knowledge gets from the outside and into the center and across the different parts of the company. And so it's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of working. And it's no coincidence that digital companies do better these days than some of the old companies. And the old companies sort of grok that they need to change, but they don't really know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, change is oftentimes very challenging.
Of course.
Especially, oftentimes change means, at least for the short term, you're doing more work than you were before. So the change seems kind of painful. It's like, well, wait a minute. I thought this was supposed to save me time, and it's not saving me time.
That's a great point. And so it's really one of the biggest objections I hear is we don't have time to do what I call exploration work, right? Which is when you're faced with uncertainty and you don't know the answer anymore, you have to go find the answer. And so really my biggest challenge is convincing leadership that if you actually build learning or exploration modes into daily work, you'll make the execution work more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, as you were talking about knowledge at the edges, it sort of reminded me of I've done a couple of startups, and I can clearly remember that, you know, when we had 3 employees or there was 6 of us or a dozen of us, right around a dozen, we would have lunch together every day. And that was our communication vehicle. So all 12 of us knew exactly what was going on. You know, decisions were often made at the lunch table, and that was it. But once you get bigger than that, all of a sudden, not everyone can make it to lunch anymore.
Right.
And you have to start sort of figuring out now how you're going to communicate, how you're going to have this 2-way flow of information, not a 1-way flow of information. So what are some of the things that you do with companies to sort of help them get to this new place?
So we usually tackle pretty significant areas of uncertainty, and you could start smaller and look for lower impact, easier things to do. But typically the companies that we're working for are going through some sort of digital transformation. And so they really realize that they not only need to digitize their products, but they have to change the way they're structured and managed. And so the first thing that we're doing is we're setting up teams. And I really believe that this is true all across a company. You really shouldn't have just individuals working on something. You actually should put everybody on a team. Even if their work naturally doesn't mean they ought to be on a team or they need to be on a team, forming teams solves a lot of the communications problems. They hold each other accountable to work. So it's not like the manager has to sit on top of them, but just your peers, you'll hold them accountable to work. If somebody has a bad day, then it doesn't hurt the flow of the team. And then it's that team that has a very concrete mission and what the desired outcomes are and sort of the rules of engagement, so the guardrails for that team and the metrics used to measure progress. And the first thing that we do with that team is that we tell them they are responsible for reporting out their progress. It's not up to them to wait for somebody to ask them. And so you're establishing a cadence right from the get-go that here's the top line metrics, here's the progress that we made, here are the big wins that we had, and here are the challenges and the places where we need help overcoming that. And if you start giving that proactively to management is going to feel so much more at ease. They're not going to start using their imagination to fill in gaps with their own, fears or whatever. And it actually makes managers be more proactive, less reactive, more proactive and more strategic, which is what all management wants to be anyway. And so I think that it's one of those interesting things that from the get-go, you have to change that mentality that it's up to the individuals on this team to report their progress on a regular basis in order to put the managers at ease and build a sense of trust, actually, even between them.
Yeah, yeah. I can remember, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, there was several car manufacturers that sort of changed the way they did final assembly. And they did exactly what you're talking about. They had a team of half a dozen or a dozen people, and they did the final assembly for the whole automobile, as opposed to moving down an assembly line. Now, are there some tasks that this approach, some types of tasks or classification of tasks that this approach works well for, and maybe others it doesn't work as so well?
I'm sure there are. I mean, I guess I think that what I'm really trying to capture is how to deal with uncertainty. And so
Mm,
if you're in situations where there's very low uncertainty still, where things are really truly known, then I don't think that this structure is as important. Personally, I don't see any downside for putting them on a team anyway, even if it's low uncertainty work and they're just repeating the same thing. I still think that that team will hold sort of this social accountability in a way that it's more difficult for managers in a hierarchical sense to do that. So I still think that there's benefits, but I also don't think it's required. And in the end, in areas of low uncertainty, the company's going to look very much like it does now. It's just that
yeah,
you've gotten there from a different direction.
yeah, yeah. Now, we had a really big disruption here 3 years ago called COVID, and it was a great forcing function that really changed the way that organizations interact. Uh, and but that was a forcing function. We had no choice.
Right.
Oftentimes, if you want to make a change, there's a choice, right? There is no forcing function like there was in COVID. So, talk to me a little bit about sort of how COVID helped, or maybe it didn't help, and are companies more open to these types of things these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was writing my book Disruption Proof during COVID, and the book changed because of it, sort of not surprisingly, probably. But it started out as being, here are sort of these 10 ways that I think companies can go through the type of change that I thought that they needed to go through. And then once COVID happened, it, like you said, it's a forcing function. It sort of wasn't then really a choice. It was, if you wanted to thrive and maybe even survive, you had to do these changes. And what was interesting is that organizations that I had worked with and some that I had not worked with, how did they respond, having adopted some of these exploration or lean innovation principles prior to COVID? How did they respond? And they ended up becoming case studies because their response was often quite extraordinary. They were able to, with agility, make changes to very fundamental parts of their business because they had already sort of prepared themselves, the mentality to be able to do that sort of thing. So my take is that there are still a bunch of companies that haven't really done that change yet. It's now kind of called digital transformation, and people are sort of getting on board. But again, I kind of don't think that they know how to do it. They focused on the technology more than the people, and I think it's the people that are more important than the technology. They often do these top-down changes, which I don't think work in this situation because it's really behavior change that you need to change, and that's you don't change behavior because somebody told you to. You have to be taught and practice this new way of change. And often these big companies hire the big consulting companies who actually suffer from the same problems that big companies do. Right. So I think that there's a greater understanding of the need to change, but I still think that they're struggling with it. And it's because it is just really a huge undertaking. If you think about some of these massive businesses, and to think that they need to start on the bottom floor and work their way up, that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
But again, just like the startups that you were in, you start small and you figure out what works, and then you scale what you learn, and then you go back and say, okay, what changes do we need to make in order to make it to the next level? And so you really just have to take that same approach to driving change inside of big organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds great. So, is there a sort of, I just had a question while you were saying there, I got to ask him this question and it just vanished. I'll think of it later. So let's think about Oh, warning signs. So if I'm running a business right now, let's say I'm a CEO or a president of an organization or even a midline manager, and I have an organization that I'm responsible for. Are there warning signs that I should be looking for, or characteristics that says, gee, I need to change the way we do these things because it's clearly not working?
Well, I actually think that what I hear from leaders, the reason why they start looking for things is because the desired outcomes aren't being achieved.
Mm,
And so I think that it's easy for us to define desired outcomes. Desired outcomes could be, decreasing costs or increasing customer satisfaction or improving employee engagement or happiness, revenue, of course, profit margins. I mean, so there's pretty classic, maybe market share, taking market share. So those are the big ones. But then
yeah.
when we start getting down to like projects and initiatives and products, this is where you often hear that the outcomes are not very well defined, number one. And so it's a very kind of loosey-goosey feeling afterwards that this isn't what we expected,
Yeah.
that there's sort of, we didn't get what we wanted. And so I think that that's a huge red flag. Number one is you got to get better at defining what your outcomes are. And a matter of fact, in this day and age, they really need to be quantifiable. We're going to improve customer engagement by 15%, quarter over quarter or something. And the moment you can measure the outcome in that sort of way, then you can measure the progress towards that outcome. You can measure like, well, we're up to 5% and we think we can continue to improve. Where's our bottleneck? And you start asking the right questions in order to be able to get to that desired outcome. And suddenly what you can find is that by establishing the right metrics for teams, you can align those with what the desired outcomes of the products or the projects are. And lo and behold, the outcome of those will align with strategic priorities. And I've worked with some of these organizations that define that stuff so softly that in the end, different groups are like, well, I did my job, it must have been them over there.
Yeah.
And you can tell that you have the wrong metrics if that's the case, right? Because as long as somebody can say, well, I was on time and under budget, yeah, but we didn't get the revenues or we didn't get the customer satisfaction. And like, well, that's not what you were measuring me by. And so I think a lot of it really comes down to metrics. And one of the great things about the digital age is you can measure pretty much anything. You just have to put your mind into the way of developing the metrics of what determine the desired outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Earlier we talked a little bit about forcing functions. And, if you go back 100 years, Henry Ford's time, if you had a manufacturing business in town, you just had to be that best manufacturing business within 100 miles because that was sort of your distribution. You weren't shipping product around the world. Now, of course, we talk about, global interconnectedness, this ability to manufacture products in one part of the world and ship them all over the world. What kind of forcing function has that been, and what has that forced companies to do?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think that there's a lot that's gone over the last 50 years that led to that. Some of them positive and some of them not so positive. And so I think that if you look back in the industrial age again, and you look back to Henry Ford and there weren't all that many competitors, to be honest.
Yeah.
The competitors that were there, eventually forced him to change that assembly line, even though he didn't want to, right? But what you could measure, it was reasonable to measure financial efficiency. Am I getting more output for the input that I'm giving, right? And so if it's a very well understood market, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. For all of the labor and all of the materials and the parts and all of that, I want to be able to get more of a car than what I have, and that improves efficiency. So we sort of stuck with that, and I think that we essentially took it too far, and we lost the mission of the business somewhere along the way. So in other words, Henry Ford doesn't want to create more output for more based upon input just for the sake of output, right? It's in order to produce a car that the middle class can afford and enjoy and are going to buy another one, right? So that gets back to the mission. I wrote in my book, and it's sort of this funny thing that my economics professor said way back in college. You know, you can use like whoever that Russian comedian was. You know, in Russia, when you're producing 2 million pounds of screws, they will make you 2 million pound screw, right? And so it's not just the efficiency of output, it's the efficiency of output for that to serve its purpose.
Yes.
And we sort of lost that so that we become financially efficient. It's still going on today. Financial efficiency became the only thing that big corporations cared about. So that meant cheaper materials, offshoring, cheaper labor, and all of these things just to drive down the input cost, regardless of what you got from the output. And that's, you know, everybody sort of goes, well, that's all about the shareholder value and all that type of thing. And I don't even care about the shareholder value. It's definitely reasonable, except that it has to be in service to the mission. And it's really interesting to me that we sort of lost the mission part of what that output is supposed to do. And if I tell you, listen, we need to maximize the efficiency of creating the value that we're trying to create. If you had to maximize efficiency for, you know, providing transportation from point A to point B, then that just adding that mission statement means, well, maybe we need to build into supply chain redundancy, because what if all of these mechanisms that are making our scooters to get you from point A to point B, we can't get any of the parts? Well, that means you can't solve your mission. Okay, so maybe I need some supply chain redundancy, or maybe I need to onshore chips now in order to always have a supply. So just by adding the mission statement back into what that financial efficiency should be for, in creating value for our customers, I think we start making better choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's sort of about balance, right? It's balancing all of these various things that we can measure and understanding which ones are the key ones and the important ones, and which ones, you know, are the ones that drive us, as you said so eloquently, towards our mission.
Right. So, I mean, you know, like Uber's not going to start flipping hamburgers if they find out that they can make more money with hamburgers, because that's not their business. And a matter of fact, shareholders are not going to buy Uber because they've learned that suddenly, you know, Uber's got this amazing new way to make a burger. Even the shareholders sort of understand that contract. I'm buying shares in this company because I believe that their mission is going to make me a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah. So in these types of organizations, if I'm a leader in one, do I want to look for certain type of characteristics in prospective hires or employees that, you know, are more attuned to being able to behave in this new way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that what we need to do is look at the middle management layers and not necessarily worry so much about, you know, the solo practitioners or the younger layers. I think that younger people, tend to want this more. They're ready to be more entrepreneurial. They want to exercise their creativity and their inspiration, but I think almost all employees do.
Yeah.
I think that what I see in working with these companies, it's the middle management that is sort of, it's more difficult for them to change. And it's understandable. I mean, they've advanced in their careers because of the old way, not the new way.
Right.
And so try to get them to do it the new way is going to be pretty rough. But I think that we have not invested really in training in middle management, to be honest. As a matter of fact, when they were probably first hired as managers, they weren't trained in anything. And so I just really think that that's where a lot of the investment needs to happen, is up-leveling the skills of the middle management so you can teach them how to manage teams that are working in a more agile, self-organized, fast-moving fashion.
Yeah, yeah. So if I was reading some information about you, and I think in your book, Disruption Proof, you talk about sort of 5 key elements that are important. Can you go over those with us?
Right. So the 5 E's are sort of describe this behavior that I think should become standard inside of all corporations. And the first is empathy. And so that's, you know, from a customer perspective, that's understanding customers deeply. It's not just going and asking for feature requests. It's not just, you know, having them fill out a survey, but really trying to understand what drives them, what their environment looks like, you know, what their aspirations are. And of course, I think that needs to apply inside the company too, for your employees. all these organizations that are creating these hybrid, remote work policies without actually trying to understand what their customer needs is absurd. I think that the one caveat I throw out there is just because you learn about your employees or your customers deeply doesn't mean that you have to go and solve all of those things that you uncover, but it certainly gives you way more wisdom, and at least you understand what the implications of your policies are. And so there's just no downside to understanding each other more deeply.
Yeah.
The second one is exploration. And so that's some of the skills that I'm talking about, where you're willing to test your assumptions. You're willing to admit when you don't know the answer. That's, one of these things that leaders need to learn to be able to do. The moment you admit that you don't know, you're opening yourself up to learning. And again, this is what's going to drive, I think, increased productivity and efficiency, is open up the world for exploring what's the right answer now that the world is in a different state. So the third is evidence. We want to use insights that we glean plus data to help inform our decisions. We want to cut through our biases and what we really firmly hold to be true and allow the data to sort of unleash what some of the different possibilities are. And it's a great way to overcome conflict, is to agree on how we're going to run an experiment, the data that we're going to hold ourselves to. So I don't think data should make decisions for us, but it certainly should be influencing. The fourth E is what I call equilibrium. This applies to not only allowing employees to balance their life out a little bit, but it's this idea that the amount of exploration versus execution that you have to do changes inside your organization. And so it's sort of a sliding scale. It's a continuum. It's needed everywhere. Exploration is not just for your innovation team. Your execution team needs it as well. They just need it a little bit less. So how can you uncover where there's uncertainty? Is it just hitting your numbers this quarter? Is it increasing satisfaction? Is it making your employees more contented? Where's there uncertainty in your business? And then once I figured it out, then I go into execution mode again. And again, this is just the common way startups work, right? They understand there's a bunch of things that they don't know yet. So they go figure it out, and then they put it into the execution engine. But you always need to be checking in to see if there's continuous improvement or if there's new things that have emerged that require you to do some learning again to learn how to overcome those barriers. And then the last E, the fifth E, is ethics. They can't just be values on the website anymore, especially in the digital world where it's really easy to sit behind a keyboard and do things that end up being destructive or not very ethical. And so I think we need to build that into our daily work. I think Teams is another way to do that. Teams will hold each other accountable to the values of the company as well. And so it really just needs to be built into our work.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to go back to Teams for a second. I think you said this, but I wanted you to emphasize it maybe a little more if you did say it. and that is that there's the goals within each team, but then there's the goal that all of the teams collectively need to achieve.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So I didn't really talk about it much. I allude to it and I write about it in the book. It's sort of a team of teams, right? So that you have it's sort of in a non-hierarchical sense, but there is a hierarchy there where if you have a bunch of teams, you need this layer above where representatives of those teams come together, and they're responsible for ensuring that the aggregation of all the work that's going on below is achieving whatever that larger ambition is. And the example that I heard about once was this guy from Spotify that was telling me this. And so Spotify uses these things called chapters and guilds to organize their work in a way that is all team performance oriented. And also, by the way, individuals have their individual needs handled by a different reporting direction, which is, skills and mentoring and life coaching and those type of things. So that's still happening even if they're on these teams. But what was interesting is that Spotify, they had all of these teams with all of their different missions, and yet the overall experience of the app was kind of clunky because of the different ways that they had implemented that. And so you needed to create this higher layer that aggregated all the work and then could look at it from a higher level, a higher context, to make sure that everything was still aligned and working properly. And you can imagine that then if you're doing that for one product, Well, then you have multiple products. And so then there's another team of teams where there's a level of, okay, now we're at the business unit level. We have to make sure that all the aggregation of all of our product outputs is getting us towards the metrics that we're signed up to achieve this year. And suddenly all of these middle management that is, responsible for these different layers of teams, they get to allocate resources differently in order to achieve their objectives. They're funneling new information up to the top of the company for things where the company might need to change their priorities. They're giving warning signs about factories closing in China, that might affect you. And so it ends up making those managers way more strategic. They're not just managing individuals and fighting fires, but they're actually doing the real work of allocating resources in order to achieve the objectives. Yeah. And so this is what I sort of call this cascading missions, where you actually are structuring your company based upon this flow of missions. And again, they're not all cross-functional teams. And again, you may get to the point that a good chunk of your company looks exactly as the same way as they do now, but this cascading missions allows you to deal with uncertainty and deal with big changes as well as small changes, as well as to draw a straight line from people's work to the company outcomes, which is just seems obvious to me, but not the way things that are these days mostly.
Yeah. Wow. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate you being on the podcast. Is there anything that I did not ask you that you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that you probably talk about your startups in the sense that what people need to be able to start small, right? Don't confuse the size of the first step with the size of the journey. It can seem overwhelming, but if you're if you're on a team, then to me, see if you can form a team, or if you're an individual, see if you can form a team of people around you, even if it's sort of ad hoc and informal. If you are managing a team, find some small uncertainty that will drive some amount of impact for you, and start teaching the team how to interact this way, and give them some responsibility to make decisions. So there's ways to start small that actually can create momentum inside the organization for making the longer journey towards change.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. So if people want to find out more about you and the books you've written, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah. So my email is brant@brantcooper.com. I encourage your listeners to reach out. I respond if it, makes through my spam, and Brant Cooper on all social media. If you're more interested in the large enterprise work, the medium and large businesses, that's movestheneedle.com. And I'm also developing courses on startupbluebook.com. So a bunch of different ways to reach out. And I really hope I hear from some of your listeners.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you again very much for being on the show. You've been a wonderful guest.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great for being here. Thank you.
Bela, well, that was a really interesting interview with Brant Cooper. What were your big takeaways?
Mike, there was a lot of stuff in there. Let's unpack a couple of them. So one, I think that struck me was sort of making sure that as an entrepreneur, a founder, or a leader of any organization, you sort of define where you're trying to get to. What's the goal line? What are you trying to achieve, right? What do you want to achieve? And then the next piece is, how do you want to get there? What's sort of the path you want to take? And I think the path is sort of related in many ways to sort of your mission. Because how you do stuff is really revolves around your mission. What are your guiding principles? What are the things that you want to be known for as an organization? It's not just reaching the goal line. It's how we got to the goal line. What was the journey like to get to that goal line? And then, of course, you need to have sort of some measurements. And measuring is very, very important, not just for the leadership team to sort of know how the ship is running, but also for the people who are doing the work. And it's important for all levels because it's their feedback mechanism as well. So don't think of metrics or measurements only for leadership. It's for everybody. So when you design your metrics, you want them to be in such a way that everyone in the corporation, everyone in the organization, I should say, understands them and can measure their performance as it relates to those metrics. So I think those were sort of the couple key takeaways for me. What did you think, Mike?
Yeah, I agree, Bela. There was definitely a lot there, and I really listened to every word carefully. And this is one I might listen to again, right? Because there was so much there. But I was really drawn to this kind of conversation about mission. I was thinking, kind of about the startups I've been involved with and worked with, and I was interested to hear kind of, okay, putting on your VC hat again is. We always encourage entrepreneurs to have a clear mission, right? It's something that we kind of
Mm.
expect in the pitch or in the business plan if you're kind of old school about it. But um, yeah, when you really get right down to it, is mission statement really important for a startup, for entrepreneurs, or is it a lot of crap? And kind of what did you look for in terms of mission statement? Was it something that was on your radar screen when you were evaluating companies?
So I think mission is interesting, or mission statements are interesting. Almost everyone has one because in MBA school or in business school we said, hey, it's important to have a mission. And and what I really look for is not what the mission says, but how do you follow it? How do you use it as an organization as guiding principles? How do you use it to guide the decisions you make, to guide you in where you're going? That's the link I want to see. So I want to see the link between what the mission says and what your actions are, what's your execution, what are you doing in the business? I want to see that link. I care less about what the mission is because oftentimes they're flowery words, and they're sort of they can mean 4,000 different things to each individual who reads it. So what's important is how do you then take that mission and turn it into action, and what's the link between those two? So that's what I look for.
Cool. Yeah, I really agree. I think that you can have a great mission statement that really is unique and captures the spirit of the intentions of the startup, of the founding team. But if you don't use it, if you don't spread it throughout the organization, if people don't know it or they don't believe it, it's useless. And the same thing, I've seen companies with kind of some mediocre mission statements,
Yeah.
right? There's nothing really unique about it, but they use it so effectively that it really does influence. People think, I should make this decision in this way because it's our mission. And maybe it's not explicit,
Right.
maybe it becomes implicit, or it's just kind of a part of the culture in the background, and it influences who they hire and the types of questions that they ask at interviews and how they evaluate their employees and all of these things, right? It just seeps into the operations of the organization. So yeah, I mean, the winning combination is great mission statement that brings uniqueness to the table, that leverages core competencies, all these buzzwords, but that really means it makes you special. But the implementation of how you use it is the second part. And you really, I think, to be a superstar, have to have both. And that's been kind of some of the things, at least in I have much less experience than you do, but in my career working with startups and being involved in startups, so when you had both things, it made it really easy. When you had
Yeah.
both the statement itself and you were actually practicing it. So I totally agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah. Agreed.
I thought the 5 E's were interesting. Did you have a favorite of his? I'm always a little skeptical when there's 5 this or 7 that, and I get it. I do this when I'm teaching too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
sometimes you unpack some of these, and there's some nice substance there. So I thought some of these 5 E's were pretty cool. What did you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite or not. A couple that I thought were sort of important were, I think exploration is important. And I go back to, if you're running an organization, are you a fast follower or are you sort of trying new things? And when I mean fast follower, I mean compared to your competition, right? There's a lot of great companies that just fast follow, right? They look at what's going on in the marketplace, and they follow that. They try to copy that. But there's other people that I think about that explore. They try new things. They try new opportunities, new products, new services, new ways of doing things, and they give the people in that organization the opportunity to do that exploration, which I think again is important, and that maps back to your culture, hopefully, or your mission statement, I should say. Are you an organization that empowers people and gives them the opportunity to explore and try new things? So that was one that sort of struck me, I guess.
Yeah, I like that one too, and then I like the equilibrium one, that you have to kind of um, do this idea of, yeah, we have to explore, totally agree. But we also have to execute at the same time. And you have to have some sort of, I like this word equilibrium. I usually call it balance, right? But you have to have a balance between the strategic and the tactical, or the strategic and the operational. So, so I thought that was really cool. And they're good. Even though we always say, oh, we'll be strategic, I think that, that especially entrepreneurs, when you have a million things going on and a lot of pressure, and right, you're really pushing hard to move to the next level. But it's really important that especially entrepreneurs, but all managers, take some time to explore and to be strategic. Sure. And to, again, you can do a great job with the current version of your product, but if you don't have the next version and the next version after that kind of in development, somebody's going to come and imitate what you're doing and beat you to the punch. So it's this idea of having one eye on this quarter and one eye on next year and 5 years from now to really kind of to keep things in equilibrium. And even if the entrepreneur themselves isn't the person that's being strategic or being the operational person, that's so critical to have people like that on your team, that you can say, look, I'm the CEO, I'm focusing on execution, right? But I've got my COO that's focusing on exploration, my right-hand person or left-hand person if you're left-handed, whatever, right? But you've got this team where somebody's got responsibility for both. The other way around, I've worked with some startups where the CEO was really the dreamer and the visionary. Well, that's what I just said. Sorry, flip it the other way around. Was really the nuts and bolts operational person, but they had to have a chief strategy officer or somebody who is a chief of R&D or a chief innovation officer that was, and the titles don't matter. I'm just using it as an example. But this idea that you have somebody closely that's on your team, then they're looking at that. They're making that a part of their job.
Yeah. As I heard somebody once say, if you don't make your product or service obsolete, meaning you replace your existing products and services with something better, if you don't make them obsolete, somebody else will.
Yeah, it's so important. And we've both seen that so many times where, it's the one-hit wonder, right? They have a great product or a great service and they get it into the marketplace, which is always, it seems like it's the hardest part, but they're not ready when the competitors come in and start to do the same thing and imitate what they're doing, and they don't have version 2 ready, because they've already won that business. That's the hardest part. They've got customers, but they can't keep up on the innovation side or the creativity side or the service side. So
exactly. What do you say?
Great.
Wrap this one up, Mike?
Yeah, let's wrap it up. This was great, but thanks for doing the interview again, Bela, and it's always great to talk with you about these things. Listeners, big thanks to you for joining us today. We hope you found this episode as interesting and thought-provoking as we did. And of course, if you have questions about what we discussed today, we're always happy to hear from you, and we're happy to answer. Our email is bela.and.mike@gmail.com.
Hey, and if you like the podcast, tell your friends, and also hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting application. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you soon.
Thanks. Great, Bela, from over here in Münster, Germany. We'll see you next time.